Please have a seat. Calvin Coolidge was not one of our more popular or really better presidents. Good old silent Cal was a taciturn man who abdicated the authority of the presidency to Congress, and who pretty much did not a lot but not talk and sleep extensively and be cruel to his staff and his family and any reporter who showed up to talk to him. It's kind of weird, though, because when Coolidge was the governor of Massachusetts, he was renowned for his good work, for his diligence in office, for not being afraid to use the authority entrusted to him, for being a real go-getter. So what happened? Most people think Calvin was just whatever. He just couldn't deal with the authority, or the problems in the city were too much, or the city and the country were too much. But in 2003, a political scientist called Robert Gilbert out of Northeastern University published a book that used the sort of modern tools of medicine, particularly mental health, to rethink Calvin Coolidge. Because there are a few pieces that never get talked about his life. When he was 12, his mother died. And as he went in to say his parting words to her, his father said, "Don't cry, she's about to die." And so Calvin didn't. And only 5 years later, his only and beloved and older sister died. And again, Calvin pushed it somewhere deep inside of himself. So flash forward, he's successful, and he's vice president, and then Warren G. Harding, also a paragon of good governance, dies. Aren't you glad you get my political commentary, too? I think scholars agree about Mr. Harding's capabilities. And Coolidge ascends to the presidency. And in 1924, in the summer, a beautiful June day, he's playing tennis with his beloved son, Calvin Jr., and a couple of his security personnel. Things have changed since then. And Calvin Jr. hasn't played for a while, and he ends up with a blister on his heel. Now, I get blisters all the time. I put Neosporin on and a Band-Aid, and we're good to go. But it's 1924, and Calvin's infection takes root, and within 5 days, the young Calvin Jr. has died. He's no more. And his father is ravaged. And if you put that over Calvin's presidency, what you begin to realize is right after that loss, he goes to sleep for 12 hours a day. And he begins to just not have the ability to make decisions. And he starts being just mean to people. And so what I think Gilbert compellingly says is, look, he had some bad policies. We can't let him off the hook entirely, but perhaps he was so clinically depressed. Because trauma work tells us that often later in life, for children who had losses, later in life, another loss that comes can bring all of that back up, especially if it was suppressed, and just create debilitating circumstances. Maybe Calvin Coolidge was just debilitated by a grief that sank into a depression that in 1924, no one knew what to deal with. Jeremiah often gets labeled as a grouch. Bishop Sean likes to talk about him as like everyone's cranky old uncle. And he's generally considered kind of the squeaky and annoying prophet of the Old Testament. But considering what I've just told you about using our modern understanding of mental health and medicine to think about people in history, let's just not stop at Calvin Coolidge. Let's go back to like a few more centuries and think about Jeremiah. Jeremiah isn't looking to be a prophet, but God shows up anyway. God has a habit of doing that, you'll know, maybe in your own life. And God says, look, I'm calling you to be a prophet. But here's the deal, Jeremiah. It's going to be about as much fun as nothing. Because you're going to go to all the people, and you're going to proclaim that if they just turn back from their wicked ways, the invading empire would stop. But here's the catch, no one's going to listen to you. No one's going to listen to a thing that you say, but you got to do it anyway. You got to go and do it anyway. But everyone is still going to suffer enormous destruction. And I've always sort of admired Jeremiah for the fact that he does go and do it. But God was right. No one listens to a blessed thing that comes out of that man's mouth. And the book of Jeremiah is like this terrible, devolving history of like bad political decisions that end in a terrible siege and death and destruction for all of Judah. And as we read that, what gets interspersed is the voice of Jeremiah, like today's passage, railing at God, railing at the fact that no one will listen to him, devastated that this is what he's called to do, and yet it's like a fire in his bones and he can't stop talking about it. And he does this sort of fluctuations of up and down and up and down, and perhaps he's just a guy struggling, or perhaps it pushes him into something very close to depression. I mean, let's do the catalog of things that happens to him. He's thrown into a cistern. That's a lot of fun. He's kidnapped and carted off to Egypt. Not a holiday. He's rejected by all of his friends. His family decides to disinherit him and not talk to him anymore. Everyone he talks to refuses to listen to him, even though he knows the truth. And he has to watch his city get burned down around him, tons of people die, and then go into exile. You could make a compelling argument. The man has endured trauma, and he's actually a character who might really suffer with depression. I think I could be compelled by that. I'm not going to stand up and make a scholastic argument about it. Bishop Sean and I argued about it. But I think maybe there's something else to his grouchiness. Maybe there's something else to how he's working. And so I understand that this is not the twilight of like Judah's kingship, nor is this 1924. At least I really hope there's nothing about this 1924. But I think we have a society that's endured plenty of trauma. I mean, the pandemic alone is huge trauma, even though we want to just like shuffle it under a rug and move on with our lives, and I do the same thing. But you know, there's plenty of people in our society who endure a lot of trauma. And we talk about it now a little bit more than ever before, but it still gets buried. Statistically, in this room, I'm talking to people who are survivors of child sexual abuse. I'm talking to people who are victims of domestic violence. I'm talking to people who have been some sort of sexual harassment or abuse that's happened in their lives as an adult. 1 in 5 women, 1 in 9 men. That encompasses all of us here. That's trauma. That causes a lot of mental health conditions in our society. But in addition to that, you know, I mean, our economics are not exactly stable, and the pace of technology is a lot. And I think our kids are growing up with a lot of anxiety. The amount of Lexapro being distributed last week at camp by the nurse was significant. It was significant. And I'm not faulting them for that. It's just real. The number of people who increasingly struggle with clinical depression or anxiety is a lot. And I think, too, some of us feel called to things in our lives, not unlike Jeremiah, that are just a lot to deal with. Teaching in the public school system. It's a fire in your bones to teach, but dang, I was with 2nd and 3rd graders last week who can't read. It's a lot. People who are called to serve in civic places, to do, you know, work in our court system and see families, and people who are called to work with our, you know, refugee populations. It's like a fire in your bones, but it's hard. It's hard. Nurses and doctors, phlebotomists and lab technicians, and a medical system that's overwhelmed. Or maybe just in your family, you're the voice of love, and you're the voice of something different, and it's just hard. And so we find ourselves, not unlike Jeremiah, in a place of struggle. And I think acknowledging the truth about Jeremiah, whether he is just a man who suffers and it makes him irascible, I've been there, or we're actually suffering from some kind of clinical depression or anxiety, he's a man that speaks to our times. And yet his oscillating is this interesting thing where he finds himself so in the bottom of the barrel. And then in today's passage, he comes back up and remembers God. And then he goes back down again into the bottom of the depression. And he comes back up and he knows God. There's this interesting piece of Jeremiah. His whole life is not depressed. There's this oscillation between grief and darkness and hope. And I don't know about you, but it sometimes feels like that's the oscillation of life. between how you hold together these pieces that are dark and depressed and get the help that you need, right? We live in a society that at least now we understand that rehab matters, that trauma therapy helps, that counseling is important, that medication is good, and understanding that there's got to be some hope. And we as Christian people believe in the hope of Jesus Christ. But how do you hold them together? Jeremiah somehow, I don't know if he holds it together, but he does oscillate between them. Because grief and hope go together. If everything's perfect in life, you really don't need hope. It's when things are not so great that you actually need hope. That's why Jeremiah is a great example. Things stink for Jeremiah. But he somehow remembers the God who called him. And here's the interesting thing. God always accompanies Jeremiah. There's never a moment that Jeremiah is without God. Not in a cistern, not in Egypt. God never abandons him. And more than that, God never talks back to him and says, pull it together, Jeremiah. Geez, Jeremiah, you're so weak-minded. Gosh, Jeremiah, can't you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps? He never does that. He's with Jeremiah in the oscillating ups and downs of everything that happens to him. And I think perhaps Jeremiah, here's my other hot take for the day besides Jeremiah's mental health. My other hot take for the day is that the book of Lamentations that Jeremiah writes might be his greatest ministry. So the man gets exiled and all the people go into exile and they're kind of doing a what the heck just happened moment. And they're collectively torn up and wounded and half dead. And Jeremiah composes with some people these poems that get into our scripture in the book of Lamentations. And they're collective grief. But you know, unless you name the things in your midst and find a way to grieve them, it's like disregarding a wound. It only gets worse. And I think that Jeremiah's ability to move people together into collective lamenting of the pain of the moment helps them take a step forward into healing. Bizarrely, paradoxically, it's a hopeful move. To lament is actually to move towards hope. It's to actually see the reality and name it for what it is. It's to not just sweep it onto a rug so that it comes back to haunt us later. And so I put all that together to think about who we are individually and corporately, because the church isn't a building, it's like us being Christ in the world. And maybe we're a lot like Jeremiah. Our individual lives maybe are a lot like Jeremiah. And if that's true for you or the people you loved, hear it loud and clear, God accompanies you. God doesn't tell you to get your act together or that you're weak or anything else. God accompanies you. And whatever it looks like, God is moving towards healness in your life, inviting you to take whatever step that is that you need to take. But I also wonder if we as a people aren't called to this ministry of accompaniment. That there are a lot of people in the world who find themselves like Jeremiah, struggling. And if it's not something in us to be the people who aren't afraid to look at the truth, that we don't participate in silence about mental health or trauma or abuse, we actually accompany people through it. We walk with them. Become a space that's safe and, actually more important than that, brave, for people to show up as they are, to walk with folks through that. Because sometimes when I'm walking through the darkness, I need someone else to help me see the light. And sometimes when I'm oscillating between grief and annoyance, and I need someone to help me see hope. And I hope that we do that for one another. And I hope that it's something we take seriously, that we do for the world. Maybe we help people lament the time that we're in. And maybe that's paradoxically having a lot of hope. That's something else God is doing in us and in everyone to lead us to more wholeness. May we all walk together. May we accompany one another. When we are Jeremiah or when others are Jeremiah, may we never be alone. May we always know that God accompanies us, now and forever.